Thank you very much, Victoria. Good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to be here to talk about Kabuki in the Meiji period as witnessed by foreign visitors. Please note that my talk, which will use woodblock prints as illustrations, is not about Japanese visual art, but about Kabuki theater, a major inspiration for such art. In today's world, Kabuki is an internationally known household word, even being used as a snarky term for eccentric political activity. However, until 1952, the last year of the post-war occupation of Japan, only two English language books about it had been published, one in 1925 and one in 1938. The war ended all that, and the flood of foreigners entering Japan from 1945 on led in the 1950s to a flood of English books on all forms of Japanese theater, including some that were first produced in Japanese. If you were a foreigner living or visiting Japan in the late 19th or early 20th centuries, the years just before and throughout the Meiji period, and you wish to refer to a Western language source, you had very limited options. To find the English ones, you would have had to have gone through countless books written by residents and travelers before and after the country was opened to the West in 1853, searching for random chapters or passages. In my book, Meiji Kabuki, Japanese Theater Through Foreign Eyes, we see a complete, or rather nearly complete, collection of the comments that were made about Kabuki by by a number of Americans, British, Europeans, and Australians, beginning of the 1860s and going all the way through to the end of the Meiji period. So in what follows, I'm going to give a brief overview of Kabuki during the Meiji period. Whoops. So from 1603 to 1868, Japan was under the control of the Tokugawa shogunate in Edo, which became Tokyo in 1868, as I said. In contrast, the powerless emperor and his court resided to the west in the official capital, Kyoto, in the region called Kamigata or Kansai. During those years, Kamigata Kabuki was considered dominant. With the Meiji period, however, Edo Kabuki, now Tokyo, quickly took the lead. Aside from the small Dutch trading post of Deshima in Nagasaki, Japan slammed shut its doors to Westerners in 1639. During the Edo period, one or two foreigners affiliated with the Dutch wrote a little bit about their encounters with the Kabuki, not anything particularly helpful. The doors were opened again only when Commodore Perry sailed into Uruga Bay in 1853. It took several years after that, however, before the tide of diplomats, militaries, opportunists, and adventurers was able to gain an actual foothold on Japanese soil. From 1858, a foreign settlement began booming in the former fishing village of Yokohama, not far from Edo. The presence of these foreigners, desired by some, detested by others, was among the factors that led to the Meiji Restoration, which restored power to the imperial house led by the teenage emperor Mutsuhito, who reigned supreme until his death in 1912. During that remarkable half century, the land of samurai and sumo welcomed an era of civilization and enlightenment as it modernized at incredible speed, becoming a power of such might, despite its small size, that it defeated both China and Russia in wars fought during the 1890s and early 1900s. It emerged a world power that would continue to stretch its geopolitical reach until its overreach resulted in ignominious catastrophe. Meanwhile, as modern technological inventions and innovations like railroads invaded Japan, its theaters experienced many changes as well, but nothing yet as radical as what was going on in other facets of society. Foreign exports were being brought in, experts as well as exports were being brought in by the boatload to advise in nearly every aspect of political, educational, scientific, artistic, and commercial life. However, the stage's contact with the West remained largely in the hands of government officials, scholars, and businessmen who had traveled to the West and reported back to the theatrical leadership, chiefly the producer Morita Kanya XII and the actor Ichikawa Danjuro IX. Danjuro was the era's acting colossus, an artist deemed by one foreigner after the other as the Henry Irving of Japan, a nod to the first British star ever to be knighted. Danjuro, Kanya, and other progressives struggled to introduce innovations into an art form whose complex nature and dependence on an audience of traditionalists demanded that new ideas could be introduced only incrementally. Reading the entries in the book, some brief, others substantial, back to a time when Kabuki seemed to most visitors as more of a quaint, native way to spend a day in Japan than as a world-class artistic form. Only a few foreigners were able to perceive its artistic significance. Most simply found it a pleasant, touristy diversion. These selections allow us to share the experience of 19th century travelers and residents encountering for the first time a theater that was simultaneously strange and familiar. Each writer knows something of Western theater with which he or she occasionally attempts to discover correspondences and differences. Naturally, our Meiji writers make many egregious mistakes, and there are frustrating references to unusual experiences modern scholars are unable to corroborate, but all breathe with the lungs of those who feel privileged to be seeing something that most of their readers had never witnessed and probably never would. The main chapter writers include the names you've just seen on the screen, as well as these from tourists like Reverend George Smith, the British Bishop of Hong Kong, to female travel writers like the American Eliza Ruhama Skidmore and the British Isabella L. Bird. They preserved their impressions in travelogues, memoirs, encyclopedic books, diaries, journals, letters, and magazine articles. In a few cases, their private writings were not published until well after Meiji had ended. One of the things that many described is how audiences, especially children, behaved, including their eating, drinking, and smoking. Here's a passage from British diplomat Sir Rutherford Alcock's The Capital of the Tycoon about what he witnessed at an Osaka theater in 1861. To me, the audience was the best part of the play, I confess. They consisted entirely of the middle and lower classes and had evidently come together in families or groups to spend the day, bringing with them their luncheon in lacquer cases with all the ingredients for midday meal. One immediately beneath us had a whole fish of large dimensions served, and all seemed to enjoy themselves sans gêne, but also, it must be admitted, in a quiet and orderly way. There were all ages and both sexes mingled together, as well as many gradations of class, evidently. I remarked a bonze with his shaven head, accompanied by his wife or concubine. These were soon joined by another party, and they formed one of the merriest groups. Many of the compartments were obviously filled by a family each, father, mother, grown-up daughters, young brothers and sisters, and when the piece proceeded, and the scene of indescribable grossness was going on, it was marvelous to see with what entire unconcern man and woman, young and old, looked on, either with amusement or indifference, but perfectly unembarrassed, and with no sense of indecency or indecorum. Really, these people, in some of their aspects, are altogether bewildering when we try to judge them by our canons of morality or taste. There are also descriptions of what theaters and seating looked like, what the plays on view were like, how you got into a theater and what it cost, how questionable the morality enacted on stage could be, what functions were served by the tea houses adjoining the playhouses, how much actors were paid, what the stage conventions were like, including curtains, the hanamichi, the revolving stage, the lighting, the sets and costumes, and the black robed stagehands, what they thought of the acting, the female impersonators, and the music, and most persistently, the inordinate length of performances, which could go from dawn to dusk. Among unusual contributions are several in-person encounters with the era's greatest actor, Danjiro IX, and the redoubtable politician, journalist, novelist, dramatist, Fukuchi Ochi, also Genichiro, who had been abroad multiple times and spoke fluent English, a boon to foreign inquirers. These colorful revelations shine a spotlight on how foreign theatergoers responded to the experience of what had not yet become a world renowned theatrical form. We see how often things people take for granted stand out when noticed by outsiders lacking preconceptions. And by the way, the word kabuki is rarely used. The common Meiji word was shibai until the kabukiza opened in 1889. The Meiji Ishin, or restoration or renovation, as some prefer, refers to Japan's great historical transition of the second half of the 19th century. During Meiji's 44 years, Japan shifted from a feudal society of daimyo-ruled domains under the control of the shogun to what became a parliamentarian system overseen by Emperor Mutsuhito, who was 16 when the restoration occurred. The transition brought about major political, economic, and cultural changes. Kabuki historians sometimes recognize four discrete Meiji periods, 1868 to 1878, ending with the inauguration of the rebuilt Shintomiza, the era's most prominent theater, 1879 to 1889, called the Shintomiza Age, which ended with the construction of the even more important Bukiza, 1890 to 1904, concluding with the deaths of the three foremost Meiji actors, Ichikawa Danjiro IX, Onoi Kikugoro V, and Ichikawa Sadanji, known collectively as Dan Kikusa, and 1905 to 1912, finishing with the death of Mutsuhito and the beginning of the Taisho period. During the second two periods, Kabuki began sharing attention with new forms of mainstream theater, Shimpa and Shingeki. In 1871, the male population was asked to shave off its top knot, trim its hair short in the Western mode, and give up swords. The word signifying the new hairstyle was Zangiri Atama, cropped head, and it symbolized the slogan dominating the zeitgeist, civilization and enlightenment. Kabuki, influenced by these new Western-based ideas, reflected the cultural practices coming into use with a genre called Zangiri Mono, cropped hair plays. A pioneer example was the 1872 adaptation of Englishman Samuel Smiles's bestseller self-help called Saikoku Rishi Hen in Japanese. Many other Western originals, both novels and plays, would be transformed into Japanese dramas in the years to come. A year later, one of Tokyo's three main theaters, the Moritaza, produced a cropped hair play called Tokyo Nichi Nichi Shimbun, its title using the name of an important newspaper, another foreign phenomenon. For the next decade, there would be great interest in such plays, reflecting the changing customs, although they were unable to cast off Kabuki's ingrained conventions. Their skin was new, but their bones were old. These plays, with their deliberate use of the new paraphernalia of everyday life, like bowler hats, umbrellas, pocket watches, raincoats, and the like, not to mention steamships and telegrams, with the specialty of Kikagoro V, the Kiku in Dan Kiku Sa. Kabuki began to seek a higher social status than it held during the Edo period, when actors were considered non-people and riverbed beggars. Such aspirations, part of a trend in which Kabuki became not merely a form of entertainment, but a medium of education, were a major driving force in the career of Danjuro IX. Danjuro's quest was closely aligned with his efforts on behalf of historically accurate plays, instead of the fanciful, often wildly exaggerated depictions familiar in countless classical history dramas. The new antiquarian-based dramaturgy was called living history plays, or katsureki geki, and was given academic backing by the intelligentsia and production support by Kanya, the chief Meiji impresario. These plays reached their peak around 1887, but eventually faded because audiences found them dull, pedantic, undramatic. Danjuro had stubbornly continued to do them, convinced of their importance, even in the face of growing audience disapproval. Eventually, in 1894, he would begin to focus again on classical revivals, actually inspiring a golden age of such productions, often in tandem with Kikagoro. Edo's leading theaters had been confined by the government since 1842 to a theater street called Saruwaka Machi, or Saruwaka Cho, in the then outlying district of Asakusa. A revolutionary change came in 1872 when Morita Kanya moved his theater, the Moritaza, to the heart of Tokyo in the Shintomicho neighborhood, not far from where the Kabukiza still stands. In 1875, he called it the Shintomiza. In 1876, it burned down. And in 1878, when it was rebuilt, it cemented its place as the most respected theater of the time in what came to be called the Shintomiza age, with Danjuro its chief attraction. Meanwhile, the government began to allow additional but smaller theaters, or koshibai, to have producing licenses and to open in various parts of the city. They were often called drop curtain theaters because they were forbidden from using such traditional kabuki elements as the draw curtains, the hanamichi, or the revolving stage. But the small theaters were looked down upon, and for a time their actors were discriminated against by the big theaters, or oshibai. Each acting company was headed by a star manager, or zagashira, who played male roles, tachiyaku, and a leading female specialist, onagata. Women banned from the stage in 1629 were still not permitted in mainstream kabuki. Meiji saw the formation of several all-female troupes, however, but mainstream kabuki uh, was content to keep itself all male, with the occasional incursion of female performers. As noted, a day at the theater was just that, a day at the theater, although the starting time and number of hours kept changing. Still, a dozen hours or so was common until late in the period, when the government limited performances to 8 hours. Some visitors came and went where they pleased, not staying throughout. But one writer insists that the only way to understand Japanese theater was to go early and stay late, seeing everything on the bill. Few participants in Meiji theater were as active in moving it into the modern world as Morita Kanya. He made sure that his Moritaza be built in the Shintomiza, where everybody could see it without having to go all the way out to Asakusa. And he included there for the first time the most advanced features, including fireproofing, although the theater burned down quickly afterward. Eventually, his ambition got out of hand and he took a huge financial blow. Danjuro was himself in such deep debt in the early 1870s that he was reduced to wearing a flimsy kimono in winter and to touring the provinces to escape his creditors. But when he joined up with Kanya at the 1878 Shintomiza, the newly built or rebuilt one, he quickly established himself as the nation's top star. He and Kanya shared a strong passion for reform, something that the government had begun demanding as far back as 1872. Leading theater figures, managers, actors, playwrights were summoned by officials. Inspired by reports of Japanese elites returning from abroad, the officials told the theater folk to cleanse the theater of obscenity and produce plays with educational values commensurate with Western theater. And like Danjuro, the government wanted history to be treated truthfully, including the previously forbidden use of real names. Hashiba Hideyoshi could no longer be called Mashiba Hisayoshi, or Oda Nobunaga be Oda Harunaga. Nevertheless, when the old plays were revived, the standard names remained. Oboshi Yurinosuke in Chushingura was not changed to the real name of Oishi Kuranosuke. An important dramatic stimulus arrived with the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, in which Saigo Takamori's samurai army was roundly defeated by imperial conscripts. Suddenly, the theater became a place like dramatized reportage to present scenes from the war. The play, based on battleground news reports, was called Okige no Kumo Arao Asagochi, the morning east wind clearing the clouds of the southwest, and was staged at Kanya's Shintomiza with Danjuro as the late Saigo. It made so much money, it put Kanya's career into overdrive until his ultimate debacle. The dividing line between our first and second periods of Meiji Kabuki and is the opening of the new gaslit Shintomiza in June 1878. That year, British world traveler Isabella L. Bird wrote in Unbeaten Tracks in Japan an eyewitness account of the Shintomiza's famously significant inauguration, albeit with some unexpected caveats, like this frightful picture of what the Kabuki acting company looked like dressed up in ill-fitting Western garb. Morita, accompanied by 40 actors in European evening dress, advanced to the front and right of the stage. Those who performed as females grouping themselves on the left, dressed in kimono and hakama. The actors, in European dress, arranged themselves in a dismal line, an awkward squad. Alas for them. Where was Ichikawa Danjuro, the idol of playgoers with whose stately figure in brocaded robes I'd become familiar from countless photographs? And where a host of grand, two-sworded lesser luminaries in the rich draperies of the old regime? Fanny Parks, age 6, said, "Papa, how very funny all those ugly men look." And if she had been age 60, she could not have made a more apt remark. The yellow, featureless faces, all alike, the bullet-shaped craniums, the coarse, cropped hair bristling up from the head, the flat chests, round shoulders, and lean, ill-shaped legs were exhibited in all their ugliness in Western dress, for the first and I hope for the last time. The clothes looked as if they had all been made for one man, and that man not one of the 40 who were present. It is true that they had got into them, but that is very different from wearing them. They stood in one deplorable attitude, with lean arms hanging limp by their sides, hands crammed into badly fitting white kid gloves, and looking like miscreants awaiting castigation. And that's the picture that you see on the screen that she's describing. in those unfortunate words. In August 1878, the Shintomiza instituted evening performances made possible by the new gas lighting with which Kanya equipped his theater. We've already pointed to the development of the two new kinds of kabuki one was likely to see at the Shintomiza, cropped hair and living history plays. Meiji's principal writer of these plays, as well as of conventional kabuki, was the remarkably prolific Kawatake Mokuami, who wrote at least 360 plays. One of his most important cropped hair plays came out in 1879 as Ningen Banji Kanen no Yo no Naka, Money Makes the World Go Round, directly based on British writer Edward Bulwer Lytton's 1840 comedy Money. It was an example of the kind of foreign adaptation that would fill many Meiji stages, plays that transformed the original Western material, including Shakespeare, into Meiji period Japanese characters and circumstances using Japanese names, even when the action was set in the West. As with living history plays, very few cropped hair plays remain. One that did is Shima Chidori. The Shintomiza became the theatrical destination of choice for foreign nobles, diplomats, and even former presidents, meaning General Ulysses S. Grant, whose 1879 visit gave Kabuki a huge social uplift. Here is a brief passage from 16-year-old American girl Clara Whitney. After a half-hour's wait, the general's party arrived and a large company of the elite of Tokyo. The Miyas, or prince's daughters, were all there in full court dress and looked really nice, even pretty, in spite of their queer clothing. Mr. and Mrs. Yoshida, Tanaka, Inoue, Oyama, Saigo, Nabeshima, Sanjo, the ministers, counselors, and indeed every celebrated person in Tokyo was there. It was a grand show of nobility and power. Mrs. Grant sat next to the prince's daughters, Mrs. Mori next, and Mrs. Enomoto. As the Western Gallery was occupied by the general and his party, it was consequently the dress circle, and only the highest of the nobility were set there. So I found myself in good company. In consequence, there were a great many opera glasses leveled in our direction. Now the guests had arrived. So, with the wail of a show and the clapping of the shakubyoshi, the great curtain was drawn aside, and three bamboo sudade, or shades, were visible, which slowly upraising revealed three figures representing Sumiyoshi, god of poetry, Hitomaru, poet laureate of the court at Nara, and Tamatsushima, an accomplished wife of the Emperor Inkyo, to whose names the chief glory of Japanese poetry is attached. These three characters participated in a dance so complicated and involved that it cannot be concisely explained. This finished, the real play commenced and was called Yoshiie, a Japanese historical drama in 2 acts. However, things took a turn for the worse when Kanya produced a play called Shyoryu Kidan Seiyo Kabuki, Wanderer's Strange Tale about a foreign kabuki, a play incorporating professional foreign performers. Nevertheless, the Shintomiza had several hits into the early 1880s. It survived unsteadily into the 1920s, but not always with the same name, eventually dropping to the position of a shabby second-tier venue. The 1880s saw the increasing ascendancy of dankikusa, each of whom could play both men and women, although Danjiro was generally considered the most brilliantly versatile. Even in his late 50s, he was admired for how truthfully he captured the physical and emotional nature of a teenage girl. Danjiro's acting was as progressive in its way as was his dedication to authentic costumes, behavior, and speech in his living history plays, an approach that involved consultations with renowned antiquarians, practices that occasionally earned him criticism. Even in the classics, he did extensive research that led to breakthroughs. Danjiro developed a restrained, interiorized style of acting called harage, which appears to have influenced kabuki acting in general, at least in the degree to which actors, even in stylized plays, sought sincerity and honesty. One of his most discussed innovations in the interests of realism, first used in 1871, was the elimination of the wooden clappers, the key, that rhythmically mark the end of an act and the closing of the curtain. I should have gone back to that. Oh, just keep that, yeah. The kinashi, or no clapper approach, was considered revolutionary, although the key were retained for the traditional repertory. So just imagine, just the removal of that convention of clicking the key at the end of the act was considered a revolutionary innovation. The 1879 to 1889 years were packed with important events and individuals, most prominent of which were the theatrical reform movement, the Engeki Kaidio Undo, the epical performances of kabuki for the imperial family, and the opening of the kabuki-za. The passion for reform along Western lines, most of it related to the need to demonstrate why Japan deserved to have its treaties revised, affected every aspect of life. One outgrowth of the construction was the construction in 1883 of a splendid assembly hall seen in the previous image called the Rokumeikan, or the Deer Cry Pavilion, where Japanese elites could display at banquets and balls how westernized they were, giving a rise to the term the Rokumeikan age. The 1880s saw the push to make the theater not simply a place of entertainment, but a site for the social relaxation of the upper classes, the way theater reportedly was used abroad. This led in 1886 to the formalization of such concerns in the Theater Reform Society, a government-supported organization created by a group of 23 men. None of them were theater people, however. Its three chief objectives were the creation of excellent new plays, the raising of playwright status, and the construction of a new theater along Western lines, one suitable for all forms of entertainment and worthy of performances by foreign artists. Newspapers and magazines were filled with essays, pro and con on theater reform, and activists offered public lectures on the subject. Reformers called for plays to be written by respected writers, abandonment of traditional musical narrative accompaniment, getting rid of the black-robed stage assistants, introducing actresses, elevating the tone of acting to a spiritual plane, adapting Western dramas with Japanese characters and situations, wishing for a three-story brick theater with Western seating and no hanamichi, the abolishment of the adjoining tea houses that sold tickets, served refreshments, and provided specialized ushers, and so forth. There was also disapproval of the need to always reward virtue and chastise evil, or to be overly concerned with historical fact. The reform movement fostered a particularly, let me just fix this for a second, a particularly important event during this decade when arrangements were successfully carried out for the presentation of kabuki before the imperial theater family. This epic-making event, called Tenran-geki, or Imperial Theater Viewing, did more than anything to raise the status of the theater in the eyes of the public. It took place over 4 days in 1887 on the grounds of the Azabu mansion of Foreign Minister Inoue. Kanya produced the event. Dankiku-sa topped a company of the best actors, and the plays were performed on a reduced size stage with a limited hanamichi. For the imperial family, elevated to unparalleled prestige during Meiji, to deign to look upon the once lowly riverbed beggars was a matter of great historical weight for theater people, not unlike Queen Victoria's 1895 knighting of Sir Henry Irving. Another highly significant feature was the development of plays adapted for a kabuki performance from No and Kyogen. The first such work, Kanjin Cho, the subscription list, dated back to 1840. But during Meiji, these dance plays, usually starring Danjuro or Kikagoro, became much more common. The element that gained most discussion among reformers was the construction of a modern theater. The 1889 building of the Kabukiza was not, however, exactly what the reformers were looking for. Despite its Western exterior, British architect Joseph Conder had designed its inside as a fancier version of a traditional playhouse, in which audiences continued to sit in box-like enclosures on the floor. Even when it was thoroughly renovated in 1911, with a purely Japanese exterior, it remained old-fashioned inside. This theater, which has gone through 5 incarnations in the same location, was founded not as a base for traditional kabuki, but as an advanced, innovative enterprise designed to raise Japanese theater to a level comparable to theater in the West, something happening in almost every other area of Japanese life at the time. No kabuki theater had ever had a name other than that of its place or proprietor. Naming it the Kabukiza was radical and made the word kabuki more widespread than ever as a way of designating the genre, favoring it over shibai. The following 14 years were dominated by 2 theaters, the Kabukiza and the Meiji-za. The latter, after a long history under a succession of different names, was rebuilt as a high-tone institution in 1893, equal in stature to the Kabukiza. It is still in business today, although mainly with non-kabuki genres. Tokyo was growing and spreading rapidly, which is why in 1890, August 1890, the regulations were changed so that 10 large theaters were allowed, along with 12 small ones. This increased the competitive nature of what was already a cutthroat business. Hit productions were treated as victories over rival theaters. Actors vied for salary, recognition, and position, and managers used sneaky tactics to great gain advantages. Japanese theater was not that much different from a professional sports league. Another innovation appeared in 1890 when the long-standing practice of preventing male and female actors from appearing together was abandoned, although it would be years before it became common practice. One of the most resonant developments of these 14 years was the creation of what many came to call the new theater, or Shin Engeki. The outbreak of the Sino-Japanese War in 1894 led to a surging interest in realistic, jingoistic war plays growing out of attempts to establish a new form of theater. Originated in 1888 Osaka as a form of political drama, the new theater, eventually known as Shimpa, began to catch on seriously with the productions of actor-producer Kawakami Otojiro, and his war plays closely reflected actual conditions and made a huge amount of money. The deaths of Danjuro and Kikagoro in 1903 and Sadanji in 1904 put a decisive end to a brilliant epic. One that was widely feared Kabuki would not long survive. And lacking an actor son, Danjuro had no immediate male successors. It took over half a century until in 1956 a new Danjuro was named, and then only posthumously. By late Meiji, a group of qualified young actors helped right the foundering ship, which still floats proudly today. These enormously active final 7 years would also witness the inflation, and deflation of Shimpa, the growing renown of Shimpa pioneer Otojiro, Kawakami Otojiro, and his geisha wife, Kawakami Sadayako, following multiple foreign tours in which they brought international awareness to Japanese theater, the rapid increase of outsider interest, the birth of companies doing Western influenced plays, the modernization of theater management, and the crowning milestone, the building in 1911 of a white French Renaissance style building called the Imperial Theater, the Teikoku Gekijo, still there, but in a different body. Also notable was the growing acceptance of actresses, both those who did kabuki, like the veteran actress Ichikawa Kumehachi, and those who did modern plays like Sadayako and Matsui Sumako. By the end of Meiji, the mainline venues began to settle into the current system of a monthly run of around 25 days, beginning at the top of each month. They forbade eating, drinking, and smoking. They gave you a free program, and they instituted models like telephone reservations. Finally, during all this commotion, there was the growing importance of twin brothers from Kamigata, Shirai Matsujiro and Otani Takejiro, born into a family of theatrical concessionaires, calling their company Matsutake. They had to wait, the word shochiku had to wait until the late Taisho era, using the same characters. They began acquiring theaters in Kyoto, moved on to Osaka, and then snared kabuki in their net, creating an empire of kabuki and other theatrical holdings. Shochiku went on to create a vast conglomerate, including movies and television, among other things, and continues to control most mainstream kabuki today. At this point, I'll stop, and I'd be happy to try answering any questions you may have.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Leiter. This was wonderful. I understand your book was also chosen by Choice Magazine as an academic book of the year in 2023, and I can see why. And for those of you interested in acquiring the book, you can get it on Amazon. Well, one of the questions that came up was whether you could comment on, or to please comment on, what first brought you to study kabuki.
What got me into studying kabuki?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, well, I was an undergraduate at Brooklyn College in I guess it was 1960, 61, and I had to read a book, or at least I had to read a chapter of a book, and the chapter was the Hanamichi, and it was in a book by somebody that I showed a photograph of his book earlier on, Earl Ernst, The Kabuki Theater, and it was so fascinating. And this was at a time, the Hanamichi being the runway that goes for the audience, and it brings the actors and the audience into close proximity. And this was at a time in American theater and Western theater when all kinds of innovations were being tried to break away from strictly realistic proscenium type theater. And this was one way that sort of appealed to me, the conventions of the Japanese theater as a way of being incorporated into experimental Western theater. So I read that chapter, and I got so fascinated by it that when I saw an advertisement for a fellowship at the University of Hawaii, where Professor Ernst was the chairman, I applied for the fellowship. Turned out that I got a 2-year fellowship to the East-West Center of the University of Hawaii to study with the guy who had written the chapter that I had read in that undergraduate course. And they sent me to Tokyo for my research, and so began the story.
Wow. And it goes on, and it has continued for a long time.
Yes, it is.
We have a question that came in from Daryl Carl, which is, what was the Western reaction to Shimpa and Shingeki plays in the 1890s with actors like Kawakami Otojiro, Yoho, Kawai Takeo, Yamaguchi Sadao, etc.?
There's a great book about Kawakami Otojiro by what's his name? Joseph Anderson. I really recommend it. It's I think Professor Anderson died recently, but the it's the book about um, Enter the Samurai or something like that, and it's it tells you the whole story of how this all came to be. The Western interest only came about when Kawakami toured to the West. And what he was bringing at that time was a bastardization of Kabuki like material. But at the same time, he was experimenting with Western theater as well. And he was not as politically involved as some others because it grew out of political movement in Osaka in the late 1880s. But Western interest was not particularly strong regarding these forms until Westerners saw it in a kind of Japanized version brought abroad for their appreciation and entertainment. But the true Shingeki is essentially Western theater, and it's Ibsen, Chekhov, as it was at that time, Tolstoy, and the Japanese audience also took a long time before it was able to accept these as viable forms of theater. But it did take away something from the actors who were doing kabuki because of the competition that it created. It's a complicated question, and it's difficult to answer in a few seconds, but it happened overnight, and it took a long time with all kinds of experimentation, including some of the most important developments in Japanese direction, playwriting, and acting.
Thank you. We have another question from Erwin Lavenberg, which is, what happened to the Kansai stage as the Tokyo stage rose to prominence?
Well, it just was a change in balance because it's continued to perform. You can still go to Kyoto and Osaka, but you don't see that much kabuki there anymore. It's the most important theater that remained permanently in Osaka was the puppet theater, the Bunraku, and the the actors who were important in Osaka gravitated more and more to Tokyo. So they were performing in Tokyo. They went back and forth. There was a lot of touring from one city to the other, as there still is today. But the emphasis became entirely Tokyo oriented. And when the theaters opened in for kabuki again in Osaka and Kyoto, it was always a visit from the Tokyo actors, often with local actors who had gone on to careers in Tokyo, performing in plays that represented the style of the Kansai and Kamigata areas, because those cities had their own style that was in opposition to the style that was popular in Edo and Tokyo. So they became specialists in that Kansai style, which they performed in Tokyo and would then again star in when they came back to Osaka and Kyoto to perform there.
Thank you. We have another question from Alexander Wilson, who writes, I've noted from Bansuke's that in later Meiji, the kabuki went from perhaps a play, a dance, and a play to a series of small playlets or scenes, perhaps as many as 10. Can you please comment on this?
Is he talking about the program of a day's performances?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, if that actually happened earlier in the Meiji period. It wasn't something that happened that late. What started to happen even in the Edo period was there was a lack of new playwriting, and the lack of new playwriting was supplemented by these programs called Midori, Midori, like the word green, and it would be a day of performing top selections from the most popular plays, and it would be the first act of this play, the second act of that play, whatever had become on its own a popular performing piece, as opposed to doing the entire play. So that started happening actually in late Edo period, and it continued increasingly, so that if you looked at a program anywhere in those years, it was rare to find a single play occupying the whole program.
Okay. James Huffman writes, what did Grant think? Or do you know anything about how Grant reacted to the
Well,
Kabuki?
Grant also visited the No Theater, and he left some very complimentary remarks. And apparently, he did the same thing. Now, we have to realize that a politician of that stature going to a foreign country and seeing something that, even if he didn't understand it, he was going to be complimentary. So we don't know whether whatever he said was truthful or honest or whatever, but he was certainly being diplomatic. But he did say nice things about the Kabuki as well as the No Theater.
Okay. Joan Cummins writes, did any Kabuki trained actors transition into movies? And were there any actors who went back and forth between the two?
Actually, that's a good question. There was an actor who began, I think, making movies in around 1916, and the Kabuki actor who was sort of a fringe actor in Kabuki, wasn't a major star. I forgot his name, but it's easy to find out. There was a movement from Kabuki to the movies by a number of actors, but there was one who became an actual movie star in the 1910s and the 1920s. Maybe it was Onoe Matsujiro, something I think with a Matsu in the name, but the name doesn't stick in my mind because his fame was in the movies rather than on the stage. But he did start out as a Kabuki actor.
I see. Scarlett Valle writes, Professor Leiter, was it the unofficial Kabuki actresses like Sadayako and Madame Hanako who opened the way for the official Kabuki actresses, or were there actresses within Kabuki who opened the way?
There were really never any full-time Kabuki actresses per se who acted regularly with the Kabuki actors. There would be an occasional sharing. They would occasionally be perform, typically in dances. Uh, and this is a question this is something that has gone on through the 20th century and occasionally today. But it began in, I think, 1893 when Danjiro, who had two daughters, he had no son, he had two daughters who were trained actresses and dancers who performed with him on stage as supplement or as minor or supporting roles in dances, but they never played serious dramatic roles. The only one who came close to that was this actress Ichikawa Kumehachi, who had her own students with the same name, the numerical sequence of Kumehachi the first, Kumehachi the second, and so forth. And there's a book that I would recommend whoever is interested in the subject called Danjiro's Girls. It's written by Lauren Edelson, Danjiro's Girls, which tells the whole story both of Ichikawa Kumehachi and the inception of acting by actresses in the Kabuki theater and then in Japan proper. There are a couple of other books of the same nature, but the one that's most specifically related to Kabuki is Danjiro's Girls.
Okay, now we only have about 2 or 3 minutes left, but there's one question that I think is very interesting from Philip Foster, who wrote, Kabuki has changed so much, so many times. What for you is the essence or persistent aspect of Kabuki?
Well, I guess it's the extremely high quality of the acting, which is, as in any traditional Japanese art, so perfectly polished, vocally, physically, uh, in terms of the dance element that actors incorporate into their movements, as well as the color, the exquisite costumes, the makeup, the entire visual, theatrical, musical complex performed by among the greatest actors, most highly trained actors, because they start when they're 4 or 5 to learn how to act in the world. So the entire complex of a form of such a high level of artistry in every one of its components, that's the thing that gets me about Kabuki. You can't just learn it and go into it, although they try when you're already 18, 19, 20 years old.
All right, well, listen, thank you. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but this was just a wonderful lecture. Thank you so very much. And
Thank you very much for asking me.
well, we're very grateful that you were able to take the time. And thank you everyone for participating in today's webinar, a recording of which will be posted on the JASA website very soon. Our next lecture will be a hybrid event and occur on Friday, March 14th at 5 p.m. Eastern Time with Dr. Matthew McElway, Takeo and Ichiko Itsumi Professor of Japanese Art History and Archaeology at Columbia University. The title of his lecture will be Birds, Diplomacy, and Painting in 16th Century Japan, and will take place in person at the Japan Society and be simultaneously webcast. Following the lecture, we'll have a JASA annual meeting for members. We hope that you can join us then, and until the next time, many thanks. Bye-bye.